Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. By golly gosh, there is a lot of Intel news today, and some of it is really cool, including the fact that XE4 gaming cards will indeed feature hardware-based ray tracing and have a pretty damn impressive amount of performance. We'll get into that in a moment though. I'd like to start things off with further rumours concerning Ampere. The first is regarding the clock frequency, and this is from COPT7 Kimi. They've actually been fairly accurate with several things in the past for Nvidia. Obviously, these are only rumours, so it could end up not being accurate, but the first thing is that the clock speed is apparently only 1.7 gigahertz. Previously, in July, they'd said that it could be up to 2.2, but they were not sure about that. But now, they've updated, actually today, a couple of hours ago, as of the time I'm recording this video, and have said that it's definitely fake hitting 2.2 gigahertz. The clock frequency isn't that high, maybe 1.7. Now, a couple of things. One, we don't know whether this is the base frequency or the boost clocks. Obviously, if it's boost, then that's, well, you know, kind of all there is to it, unless you crank power limits and stuff, and we'll get into the power in just a moment. But if it's the base frequency, well, I don't know, maybe 200, 300 megahertz, depending on how Nvidia divvies this up. I'm really not surprised that this is roughly the clocks of the card, because if you look at, for example, the Ampere A100, what we see is that the clock frequency was 1.41 gigahertz, although that was with a ridiculous number of CUDA cores, 6,912, which is obviously quite a lot of CUDA cores. And while we're on the subject of powering clocks, there is also another very fascinating rumour that has been floating around for the number of chokes and basically the power distribution, and this comes from Cat Corgi. Once again, they've been pretty accurate with quite a lot of stuff from the GPU side of things from Nvidia, and they have stated that there's over 20 chokes on this thing. That would be interesting. This means that the power distribution on this card is, well, impressive. Let's just make it simple. And the card itself apparently does have the irregular PCB, and this is for the RTX 3080 Founders Edition. Now, remember, there are several different cards which are going to be coming out, and what we do know, as I covered yesterday, is that the memory configurations for the Titan apparently is 24 gigabytes, but 20 gigabytes for the 3090. But it's still unsure, because some people are also saying on Chip Hell that no, the 3090 does have 24 gigabytes. So either way, we can say that there's a crap ton of memory, technical term, on this particular GPU. But there is actually a completely bonkers rumour that COPT7 Kimi, as well as others, are stating about Ampere. And honestly, I don't know the validity of this. I'm just reporting it. So I would definitely take it as a, well, you know, maybe. And that is that Ampere has double the number of CUDA cores per SM. Now, for the last several generations, basically Nvidia have had 64 CUDA cores per SM. And this has not always been the case. So we have seen in prior architectures, for example with Kepler, where this was not the case. Although, of course, they did cut down the number of SMs. What we do understand, and we're pretty certain of, is the GA102 for this particular GPU does have 84 SMs, which, I mean, this would mean that these cards are absolutely monstrous. It is imperative to realise that COPT said that they're uncertain if this is true, but it's what they're hearing through the grapevine. Personally, I would be interested if this is the case, because we've seen no indication of this with the data center implementations of the cards. But as always, well, we're unsure. It's very difficult to be certain of any specifications for any product until they release, because obviously, we may not be getting the full picture. What I am fairly certain of at this point, though, is that Ampere, in terms of raw performance, is going to be quite monstrous. I'm going to be super duper curious to see what Nvidia actually end up charging us for these GPUs. The majority of this video is going to be dedicated to Intel, because boy oh boy, Intel's Architecture Day has been, well, it's been a thing. There is so much Intel news. I'm going to link an overview, their official press statements and stuff in the video description, because honestly, if I was making a video about all of this, I quite literally would have a 4 or 5 hour video, especially if I was to be exhaustive. But what I want to do with XE is to kind of go over a overview of what they've discussed, because Hot Chips is in a few days, where they're going to be digging further into the architecture, and it seems really silly of me to kind of go really deep into the architecture from what they've stated here, when they're going to also release a crap ton of official information. That just seems, a crap ton more, should I say, of official information. That just seems, well, kind of pointless. But yeah, first things first is Alder Lake. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting Intel to do this, but yeah, they actually confirmed Alder Lake S is going to be for the PC desktop in 2021. Furthermore, they've even confirmed it is a hybrid architecture. You know what, first of all, before we go any further architecturally, thank you, Intel, for finally being a bit more vocal about this stuff. It's been a major complaint of mine that Intel are, well, honestly crap in many cases of divulging information to their customers. And I think AMD do better at communicating their future roadmap. This is particularly true as well because I think AMD do better at creating slides and just being visually more engaging with people. And Intel have a lot of faults with their PR and marketing, but this is one of those easy things that I wish they would fix because, yeah, it's kind of frustrating. But anyway, I've got to say a lot of these slides are pretty damn cool, and there's not too much, too much marketing BS in there as well, which is kind of nice. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying, Alder Lake S is going to be a big.LITTLE design or hybrid design or whatever you want to call it. Remember, I also recently discussed the fact that AMD themselves have patented a very similar approach, although whether that's going to be for desktop or whether that's only going to be for mobile implementation, it's uncertain. But with Alder Lake, we are looking at a pretty big leap. They're basically leaping 2 Cove generations forward. So it is not going to be Willow Cove, it indeed will be Golden Cove that we're seeing inside of the sucker, which, as I've discussed before, is a pretty big single-thread performance leap. Furthermore, they're going to be pairing this with Gracemont. Gracemont does come with some tweaks, including support for AVX2, but Golden Cove does support AVX 512. I'm not 100% certain still of the requirement for AVX 512 on a chip design for the desktop, but there we go. And it looks like, from what we understand anyway, most of the leaks we've seen previously regarding the different configurations are true. So, for example, you could have 8 big, 8 small cores, or you could have 8 big, 2 small cores, or you could just have 8 big cores, or you could even have 6 and 2 if you prefer, and so on and so on. So there are a lot of different combinations that Intel could do, and according to their slides anyway, there is an impressive amount of performance. They're saying that it's up to 33% higher web performance, although this is the Lakefield cores compared to their predecessors. And furthermore, they've also said, although there's not a huge amount of information here, unfortunately, that there is a lot of work at the moment that's being done for both Windows and other operating systems for OS scheduling. Obviously, that is going to be imperative for this, and there's also apparently a hardware-guided OS scheduler that will be part of Alder Lake. But as of the time I'm recording this, Raja Koduri, and for that matter anyone from Intel, are not stating what that actually is and how it's going to work. Furthermore, there's a really interesting few statements that, and this, by the way, was from an interview with Forbes, again, link is in the description, and according to Raja Koduri, the clock frequency of the next generation desktop processors is going to be impressive. They've said that the SuperFIN technology, which is going to be part of their process that they're using, is going to allow them to have, quote, very, very attractive frequencies. And apparently Raja himself is a high-end PC enthusiast, so improved voltage/frequency curves is apparently something that they're working on for Intel, for their processors for desktop. So I will be curious. I mean, does that mean that we could be seeing, let's say, 5 gigahertz for one of these cores, or even faster? Does that mean we could see some really decent overclocking potential? The thing is, next year, they will, at the very least, be going up against, well, I don't know if it's going to be Zen 4 for the desktop. I did recently cover from one of my own sources that it looks like for desktop, there's going to be a Zen 3 refresh. Unfortunately, what I'm not certain of is what the refresh is going to be comprised of in terms of performance bumps. So, for example, is it like Zen to Zen Plus with subtle improvements on, let's say, caches or whatever else, slight clock speed it bumps, or is it something just like perhaps more meaningful? Unfortunately, we don't have the answers yet. And now I want to shift the attention from Intel's CPUs to GPUs. As regular viewers will know, I've long supported a third player in the GPU market. I think that it's critical, quite honestly, to get as much competition as possible. I always say this, but competition is good. And Intel, despite what appeared to be perhaps a lot of bad news and a lot of bad PR pieces for Intel, particularly for their graphics, well, by golly gosh, it looks like they are pulling a rabbit out of their hat, and XE, for both data center as well as gaming, is actually quite monstrous. So we'll start things out first of all with a 4-tile XE GPU. And this sucker contains 16,384 cores. Now I know what you're going to say. That's an awful lot of cores. So what about the performance? Well, it's 42 teraflops. That's quite a lot of flops. And apparently, from what Intel has stated from their internal testing, the scaling for their GPUs is almost perfectly linear. So, in other words, it's almost from 1-tile to 2-tile doubles. From 2-tile to 4-tile doubles, you get the point. And yeah, it's something like 1.999 times rather than 2x. It's by 1.999, which is really bloody impressive. And this means, because these particular GPUs are designed for like video and media transcoding and those type of tasks, and from what we're seeing, XEHP is quite insane. They can transcode a 4K video real time at 60 frames per second with a single stream, and then according to them, they continue to do this and like optimize and push the hardware, and now they can do not 1, not 5, but 10 streams simultaneously. But I did mention that I wanted to focus a lot on the gaming side of the equation, And the gaming side of things obviously does have different requirements from HPC. So, for example, you don't need extensive FP64 support for it, and don't necessarily need a ton of tensor cores as well. Yes, XE, by the way, does have tensor cores. They also will reduce the cost by not utilizing HBM2E either. So instead, what they want to do is use more traditional parts, i.e. A variant of GDDR6 memory, but also adopt things such as hardware-based ray tracing, which I think most of us would agree at this point that enabling hardware-based ray tracing for a gaming-focused GPU is going to be an imperative. Basically, there are one overarching architecture that Intel are working on. So you can think of XE as like, the big main architecture. And then underneath that are several different micro architectures, which are basically tweaks and different features of that specific main architecture. So once again, for example, gaming has different requirements to the data center and AI, and exascale has different requirements to both, and so on and so on. There are, however, still some questions for this. For example, what about the number of execution units? The HP variance from leaks has 512 execution units per tile, and that basically is divided down to 4,096 shader cores, which is a lot. But what does that really mean when it comes to the gaming variants? Does that mean that we have the same EU configuration, or would it have more? Because, for example, if they're only releasing a variant which has a single tile, they may be behind what let's say Nvidia have out at the time. We don't obviously know what Ampere and what AMD are going to be able to crank out. So for a single tile variant, would this be different? And here's the crazy thing, the tests that they've been running so far internally with the 42 T-flops that I mentioned earlier was still using very early, probably buggy drivers, and the clock frequency was only 1300 megahertz. They believe that they can get higher than this, over 1.5, 1.6 gigahertz. So that could be a lot of performance for the higher tile count GPUs. But it also means, at least theoretically, that if they do manage to have roughly the same clock frequency for a single tile variant, which has a decent number of execution units, this would be far more powerful than the RTX 2080 Ti. It would actually massively outperform it, at least in terms of FP32 performance, and this is a big and, assuming their drivers are in place, because, well, if the drivers suck, who cares what the performance is? If it crashes, you can't play anything. Simple as. Second, if it has decent ray tracing performance, as well as, well, other features that we expect as gamers, then I can imagine Intel will have a very, very competitive landscape. It would be absolutely fascinating to see this, because this also is kind of the way that you can work around the SLI crossfire problem. Don't get me wrong, Nvidia and AMD are also allegedly working on similar. I reported recently that RDNA 3 is almost certainly chiplet based, but this is going to be absolutely monstrous. I'm very curious to see what Intel does in the future. I'm not going to go ahead and say that you should not buy RDNA 2 or whatever, and you should just hold out for Intel. I just really want them to be competitive. Now, as I said, this video is an overview, and it's already getting really lengthy. So I will be going deeper into the architecture fairly soon. It's just, I would rather have Hot Chips conference. Because obviously I would rather go more in depth rather than just kind of like, touch the surface when I can just wait a few days and go much deeper. But with that said, thank you very much for watching the video. Let me know what your thoughts are for Intel in the GPU arena. I have to say, and this is closing thoughts, so you can close out the video if you don't want these, but I just have this weird feeling that we could be in Twilight Zone in like, let's say 12 months time. Like, it could be a really big potential that if you are in the market for a GPU, you buy Intel and you pair that up with an AMD CPU. I mean, that would be like, I don't even know, that would be ridiculously poetic. That would be just, it would just be insane. That would just be so weird. Like, I don't know if I could actually handle that. My brain would be like, no, what's going on? Intel goes in the CPU slot. What's going on? Yeah, I don't even, that would be so bloody weird if Intel did come out on top of the GPU. I'm not saying they will. I suspect that AMD and Nvidia are not going to be going down without a fight, and I do suspect that Ampere and RDNA 2 are going to be fast. But there is always that potential that at least in one tier, whether it's the higher end tier or the mid tier or whatever, Intel will be the sweet spot for GPU, assuming their drivers don't crash. And to be fair, there's even reports from Intel that they quite literally have just even rewrote their drivers for DirectX 11, which have reduced the number of GPU pipeline stalls, improved the efficiency of the API, and so on and so on. So what I'm basically trying to say is Intel are doing a lot. They're optimizing the drivers, and I actually had the pleasure of going to Intel's GDC conference last year, which was in San Francisco, and I did meet some of the team, including Lisa Pierce, who is kind of the head honcho over there for the driver optimization. And I can tell you that that woman is extremely smart and absolutely loves graphics and technology. And, same thing for Raja Koduri as well. I've got to meet him briefly, very smart guy. And this, by the way, can also be said for Nvidia. Tons of really competent people, smart people over at Nvidia, and of course AMD as well. Absolute brilliant people. So I'm not like cherry picking. I'm just simply saying that Intel does have the talent to do some incredible work. I just hope that they can all come together, because I know I keep saying this, but I just want good products for us. I just want it. Even if, like, the perfect scenario just for me would be, imagine if the RTX 30, just for example 3080, was the best in one tier of price, and then AMD's, whatever, like 6900 was better in another tier, and rather than picking up the 3070, you would go with Intel for that tier or something like that. That would just be awesome. Different tiers, different competition. That to me is always a good thing. With all of that said, I think I've prattled on enough. Thank you very much for watching the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.